They always say watchmakers are extremely special. You hear that very often. And watchmakers are a unique breed where the entire universe is centered on a space on their desk that is no larger than 15 centimeters by 15 centimeters wide. And when your whole universe and your everyday is zoned in on just that one small square area on your desk, you start looking at the world differently. And for me, my objective was to communicate the inspirations, the motivations, the desires, the aspirations of these unique people to the rest of the world.
Humans have been measuring and keeping track of the passage of time since we first stood up straight and realized that our shadows move and lengthen throughout the day. And since then, it's just been one step after another of people making timekeeping devices. Wherever we look, every civilization, every culture has made clocks of one form or another. After the sundial, after the water clock, devices in the Islamic world, automaton clocks, clocks which represented the universe to show all of the movements of the heavenly bodies in real time. Those innovations set the clock running on what was to happen in the centuries to follow. Because what happened in the 18th century onwards is remarkable. Lots of things happened around then. The European maritime empires had been growing and growing and had been colonizing places around the world. And those empires relied on their flourishing, their growth, on ships, and on those ships being able to navigate safely around the oceans of the world. Hundreds or thousands of lives depended on it at sea, but more importantly was the future of each of those empires. Everybody knew that the solution to the longitude problem, as it was called, that's your east-west position on Earth, was time. And that if you could carry the time on board your ship as you travelled on voyages lasting several months, you could navigate safely. But how would you keep the time on board a ship? Well, this was the problem that taxed the greatest minds of the 18th century. It was the clockmakers and the watchmakers who came up with a solution after decades of patient innovation in 1759, when the first portable precision timekeeper, the first accurate watch really, was made by John Harrison. It became known as H4, and it became known as the chronometer. It became the device carried on every ship for 200 years, and it changed the world. It was the work of other makers, including Abraham-Louis Breguet, John Arnold, Thomas Earnshaw, who took the ideas, the design principles that John Harrison had devised in his H4 timekeeper and turned it into a practical device which could be manufactured in large numbers and carried on ships around the world.
John Arnold, c'était un horloger anglais qui était très important donc à son époque. Tous les horlogers anglais, en particulier lui, a eu des liens aussi avec les horlogers français. Et je pense que dans cette, dans cette compétition entre les horlogers anglais et les horlogers français, donc avec Arnold et Breguet, ça a permis, cette compétition, elle a permis d'élever le niveau et de toujours repousser sans cesse les limites de la chronométrie et de la performance. C'est toujours très impressionnant d'avoir un objet qui a plus de 200 ans entre les mains. Il y a le poids de l'histoire aussi qui fait qu'on sait qu'il y a divers horlogers, des anciens horlogers qui ont bossé, qui ont travaillé dessus. C'est toujours émouvant d'avoir ça en main, et aussi ça montre qu'à l'époque, ils cherchaient la simplicité, mais pas dans le mauvais sens du terme. C'est-à-dire, quand je dis simplicité, c'est vraiment les choses faites le plus facilement possible, mais surtout vraiment le mieux possible de ce qu'ils avaient en technique à l'époque. La compétition en fait qui faisait rage entre l'horlogerie française et l'horlogerie anglaise, Et voilà, c'était des marchés de la marine royale et de la marine commerçante. C'était des marchés qui étaient gigantesques. Donc si tel ou tel horloger remportait soit le concours d'État, soit le marché, ben, ça ouvrait en fait des possibilités de développement pour son entreprise qui étaient incroyables.
Breguet had a massive impact on watchmaking. He's known for lots of inventions. But I think in terms of artisanal watchmaking, he really set the standard, having a distinctive stylistic element. Because watches were a scientific pursuit, there wasn't much focus on what it looked like or having a consistent look. Breguet really paved the way with hallmarks like, coin edging and guilloche and Breguet hands, Breguet numerals, these sorts of things. Nowadays, if you look at artisanal watchmakers, they all kind of try to form a style of their own, and I think Breguet was one of the first to do that.
The most brilliant technical achievement is the Breguet sympathique. So you have actually two machines communicating. You have a motor clock and you have a pocket watch, the child somehow. And actually the motor is taking care of the child. So it's actually, you have, with the most advanced Breguet sympathique concept, you have three interactions. You have the winding, you have the time setting, and the time regulating. And actually, you can somehow imagine how the motor winds, gives the energy to the pocket watch. But actually, the regulation, how can the motor know if the pocket watch, the child, is going too fast or too slow? And this interaction, this communication between two machines, this is not artificial intelligence, but it's somehow mechanical intelligence. And this is what he invented somehow, that two machines communicate. And I think this is very relevant today because we have smartphones, we have internet, we have a lot of machines communicating without any humans in between. And I think that is a very crucial theme today. And he started that more than 200 years before us.
Those watches by Breguet, by Arnault, by Earnshaw really transformed watchmaking because the principles of how to make a watch, how to design an escapement, how to shape the balance so that it stores the energy, and myriad other technical developments seeped down into watchmaking traditions. They were used originally to make marine chronometers, but every watch really from then onwards started to develop the design principles that those pioneers first established.
Ce qu'ils ont fait est exceptionnel parce qu'on voit la difficulté. Mais au-delà de ça, c'est inspirant parce qu'on se dit, ces personnes-là, ils ont fait quelque chose d'intéressant. C'est pour ça qu'aujourd'hui, on en parle. Donc, ça m'inspire profondément parce que je me dis, on est obligé de faire quelque chose, peut-être pas à leur hauteur, mais en tout cas d'essayer de faire quelque chose d'assez bon. Et éventuellement, on aura quelque chose qui restera dans le futur.
It was all about precision. And competitions were held at Kew and Neuchâtel and lots of the different observatories. And brands and watchmakers would submit and pursue having a more and more precise chronometer. At the time, you had a group of people called regulars who were essentially participating in the Formula One of watchmaking. And these were the best paid people in the industry as well. They could work in their own hours and work in their own way, but obviously this all kind of stopped in around 1968 when the Japanese started participating with quartz.
The cheap quartz watches almost totally destroyed Swiss mechanical watchmaking. And the industry had to decide, do they adapt or completely disappear? And the watchmaking industry did adapt.
At that point in time, there was an English watchmaker by the name of George Daniels. Now, George Daniels felt very deeply and very strongly that quartz watches could not and will never replace the inventiveness and the artisanal craft of a well handmade watch. He was perhaps one of the most important figures in contemporary artisanal watchmaking today because he has inspired generations of watchmakers after that. But George Daniels was not alone. There were other makers, the likes of Derek Pratt. He helped with the development of the coaxial movement that eventually Daniels became extremely highly regarded for.
We saw all of a sudden the emergence of watchmakers who no longer were working for brands or doing restoration, but putting their names on the dials. And the 80s, when we look at it, it really is a period of change, and that change saw big brands going into multi-complications, testing new materials, designs, etc. But the 80s is really the period where artisanal independent watchmaking took off, and it never ended. Because all these pioneers from the 80s, nobody had done that before them. So I think the AHCI, it was Sven Andersen and Vincent Calabrese who in the very early 80s decided to all join forces, because these guys, they don't have the marketing power of the big brands to get advertisements and publicities, and they don't have boutiques. So it was a way for all of them to join forces, exhibit at the Basel Watch Fair, be the voice of a group for the industry.
When it was started, it was very difficult for those first members to sell their work, because also the industry, the communication was one thing, but also on the other hand, exhibitions, the press, there were only perhaps 20 press in the whole world, specialized for the watchmaking when Academy started. So, and then also the whole attention was on the big brands, and independent watchmaking was considered as hobby makers, and it was very challenging for them at the beginning.
We really had a big industry with very traditional values and very solidified in protecting their values and saying exactly what is possible and what is not possible to do in horologerie. And actually our group of independent horloger créateurs indépendants, we fighted to open up these grounds and actually to bring that into life today. So we have incredible individuals in this group.
Great names like George Daniels, François Paul Jaune. They were part of the AHCI, so it's, when you look at the members now, it's basically the who's who of independent watchmaking. So THA is basically, it's a dream group for watch collectors, especially independent watch collectors. Imagine phenomenal minds like François Paul Jaune, Denis Flageolet, Vianney Halter, and the Baumgartner brothers.
It was incredible as a young guy coming from the watchmaking school to already see these people, these perfectionists working on these mechanisms. It was really a great pleasure to be able to see that phenomena of THA in Sainte-Croix, where these living geniuses, watchmaker lived and worked actually.
Unfortunately, I think it didn't last too long, and each of these watchmakers went their separate ways and created their own brands and focused more on their own making than making watches for others. But it's one of these, kind of the all-star companies where you had, basically a dream team making a movement.
The 90s were an incredible era. We were building. We were not looking back. Now, yes, we were inspired, but not by the 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s. We were inspired by the pocket watches of the 19th century. So the whole industry would create the different complications, but it was trying to create its style. It was a trial and error era, which was really, really interesting because there was no dogma. There was no secret sauce. There was no, this is how it should be done. So all of us were trying stuff. We see this industry getting into pace. One comes out with the chronograph, one comes out with the perpetual calendar, and then slowly, there's a minute repeater, there's a tourbillon. And then there's this whole wave of all these brands saying, we need to do complications. And everyone needed their chronograph, their perpetual, their tourbillon, their minute repeater. And then from the mid-90s, everybody's done all these complications. So now we start making sandwiches. It's a chronograph, perpetual calendar, but it's also a tourbillon, and it's also a minute repeater. And all the brands start assembling all these different complications. And then we arrive at the end of the 90s, and all of that has been done. Beginning of 2000, something incredible happens. It's a synchronicity. I come up with Harry Winston, the Opus series. The same year, the same week at Basel World, we arrive at the fair with this amazing concept where we, Harry Winston, work with François-Paul Jouan and credit his work, which nobody had ever done that. And the same week, Goldfile, a leather manufacturer, credits 7 watchmakers who've created a product for them. How did that happen? A watch is not done in 12 months. It's done in 3 to 4 years. So how is it that this synchronicity happens and all of us arrive at the same time with new contemporary ideas, a spotlight on humanity, a spotlight on watchmakers? I have no idea, but it just happened, and it's the beginning of something very important.
The Hourglass was founded in 1979. Some of our early and historic partners were the likes of Patek Philippe and Rolex. And what was interesting at that moment, in the early throngs of the formation of the company, was that by 1980, my parents had started working with the first independent maker that we have been quite deeply associated with, and that was Gerald Genta. In 91, we had met Philippe Dufour, and were fortunate enough to collaborate with him in a small way. In 1994, the Hourglass had acquired Daniel Roth, but it wasn't really until 1999-2000 where we expanded the portfolio of artisanal watchmakers. There was a new energy in the marketplace. We had come off the back of the Asian financial crisis. We were approaching the beginning of a new century and a new millennium, and there was a lot of excitement. We were projecting into the future and trying to imagine what it was going to be like living in the 21st century. And in the watchmaking world, there was something bubbling under the surface. There were a lot of makers where they had gained new optimism to strike out on their own, to establish their own workshops, their ateliers. And so we felt it was time to tell the story of watchmaking in its entirety.
The Hourglass and Mike Tay, they're not just retailers, right? They're educators, and they're really builders of watch culture. And I'm old enough to have attended the very first watch fair they did 20 years ago called Tempest. And it was something that no one had ever witnessed before, the idea of getting together some of the greatest luminaries in the watch industry and creating this incredible environment where they could exchange ideas, they could meet the public. It really put the Hourglass on the map as one of the primary builders of watch culture. And it was a huge catalyst in Singapore, and I would say this region, for watch collecting, and in particular, the birth of independent watch collecting culture.
Artisanal watchmaking sort of took hold in the 70s, 80s, 90s, but only in the 21st century did it become a global thing with a global audience. Even though artisanal watchmaking is still niche, it's still small in terms of quantity, it has now achieved global recognition, even in the popular imagination. Watchmaking, by and large, is very traditional business, traditional industry. So avant-garde watchmaking, the watchmakers, the designers, the creators who think outside of the box, they give the business a different face, which I think is important because it gives inspiration to some of the people in the business, but it also attracts a new audience, a different kind of audience. And I think avant-garde watchmakers like Uwerk, MB&F, they show the world that watches can be something different from a round case with two hands.
When I created MB&F, a lot of people said, is there anything still to create? I mean, haven't we already done everything in watchmaking? And I had a big smile on my face going, you guys don't have a clue of what we can do. There is so much we can do if we stop thinking of it as a watch.
Watches are one of the most beautiful collectibles, one of the most fascinating art forms. In today's society, the watch is the only art form that can come with us when we leave the house in the morning, when we attend work, business meetings, go out for dinner with friends, and go home. It comes with us back to the bedroom where it started in the morning. Not even the most wonderful private jet, yacht, sports car, artwork can do that. It is the art form and the collectible form of culture that is predestined to conquer the world in the 21st century.
One thing that I love about watchmaking in the future compared to other mechanical industries is the fact that there is no life or death situation anymore. It was a matter of life or death back then. It was whether you ended up your boat in New York or in Venezuela. Now it's not the case, so you can be a lot more free with your technical interpretation of the watch, and you can do a lot more things. You can make the effort of doing something artisanally, but with a lot of contemporary technical artifacts that will bring more to the watch. My relationship with the hourglass actually developed through initiatives that we built together. One of them is the Louis Vuitton Watch Prize for Independent Creatives, which essentially tries to find new independent watchmakers and support them over time. And so today everybody talks about independent watchmaking, everybody loves independent watchmaking, and the artisanal craft comes behind it. But I think the hourglass has a role to play in holding up that trend and making sure that over time, new independent watchmakers can still come in to the industry, and the interest of collectors can still blossom through that.
Ce qu'il y a d'incroyable avec l'horlogerie, c'est que justement, tout est vraiment dans l'apprentissage. En tout cas, dans le métier que je fais, la manière dont on travaille aujourd'hui, on a vraiment besoin de cette transmission-là. En 2019, j'ai M. Hagman qui m'a rejoint, Jean-Pierre Hagman, qui est un artisan boîtier, pour moi un des plus importants de ces 40 dernières années, qui m'a rejoint pour transmettre. Je dois avouer, à partir de ce moment-là, même ma vision, ma philosophie a changé. Parce qu'au début, je rêvais d'être tout petit, être seul. Et puis, quand M. Hagman est arrivé, j'ai réalisé qu'en fait, j'ai fait ça toute ma vie. J'ai été chez Patek Philippe, j'ai appris. On m'a transmis, on m'a donné. J'ai été chez François-Paul Journe, on m'a transmis, on m'a donné. Je me dis, mais c'est incroyable. Et puis là, M. Hagman, il vient transmettre son métier. Et là, je me dis, mais c'est pas possible, il faut beaucoup plus partager. On a une responsabilité et voilà, c'est une grande famille, c'est l'industrie. Ça t'apporte d'autres visions, ça t'apporte d'autres philosophies, ça t'apporte d'autres savoir-faire et je trouve ça exceptionnel.
For ideas and techniques and technologies to grow and flourish, then people need to come together. And so throughout history, there's been places on Earth where cultures and societies and groups of people have mixed, and that has been where some of the most fertile innovation has taken place.
The beauty of I Am Watch is bringing people together. That's what artisanal watchmaking does. You're not a consumer buying from a brand. You're a connoisseur or a lover speaking to somebody who creates, and it's the human connection which makes our community so strong. Independent watch buyers are not buyers, they're not consumers. They are people who are writing the adventure with the creators. It's always been that way. And by putting 40 makers with all these thousands of fans and collectors to be able to communicate. And it's true that thanks to the digital world, we have all been able to communicate so much more than before. But then we realized there's something missing. There's that handshake, there's that looking at each other, there's that hug, but there's more importantly looking at the watches together, sharing emotions, which you can never do on the digital world. And that is what I Am Watch brought back. And we realized that we thought the digital was going to take over. It's never going to take over. I Am Watch just proved that.
My hope at the Hourglass is that we can perpetuate this interest for horology, to continue to develop new enthusiasts who are interested in learning about the stories behind these watchmakers, so that generations to come will understand the effort, the energy, the sacrifices, the ingenuity, the inventiveness that these very special individuals have made to the advancement of watchmaking for the human civilization. It's really about collecting makers that I feel are going to be considered relevant and important in art history a century from now. It then boils down to the individual artists themselves. What motivates them, what inspires them, what thread and line of artistic movement they follow. When we think about collecting artisanal watches and artisanal watchmakers, that thread that starts with Abraham-Louis Breguet and extends all the way through 2 centuries to George Daniels, and now, 50 years later, down to the 5th generation of watchmakers, is in effect a defining course that one could adapt themselves to thinking about how to collect artisanal watchmaking. And from that moment, you then find yourself going down either a single rabbit hole or multiple rabbit holes in that pursuit of that next work or that next artist that connects the dots between the past and the future.